Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
This is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. It's no secret there has been quite a few issues related to aviation in the news. We had this horrific Washington, D.C. collision between this airplane and this Black Hawk helicopter. Very unusual, very rare, and something that has raised a whole lot of questions. If that weren't enough, just a day or two later, this horrific airline disaster out of Philadelphia. Then, just yesterday, it's reported that there's this massive FAA outage. All of this has led a lot of people asking what's going on. Well, we are in luck, you and me, because we have procured the services for at least a few minutes of the person, I don't think this is an exaggeration, I don't think this is hyperbole, that I feel is the best commentator on issues related to aviation on the planet. John Nance is somebody that not only has a great voice for radio, but he's a senior aviation analyst for ABC News. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's a pilot. He's a licensed attorney and a healthcare safety analyst. The only problem with him is he has no idea what he's talking about. Very, very pleased to welcome back to the radio John Nance. John, it's been a long time. It's great to talk to you again.
And vice versa.
John, let's start with what happened in D.C. What do we know for a fact? Not speculation, not best guess. What do we know for a fact about what happened with this collision between the Black Hawk helicopter and the airplane?
We have, Frank, a lot of emerging facts here that are real facts, and as you say, not speculation, which we don't need at this point. First of all, we know that the Black Hawk helicopter and the American Airlines jet came together. They were both in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, this has nothing to do with blame. This has to do with understanding the accident so we can make things that went wrong not go wrong again in a future situation. The helicopter corridor that runs under those approaches is probably going to have to be looked at very carefully because it has a maximum altitude of 200 feet, which isn't much. And in this particular case, it was not enough of a buffer for whatever happened. We now know that the aircraft, the helicopter, I should say, and its inbound was asked if they had this inside the American Airlines jet. And they said yes, and they said yes twice, in effect. But obviously, the conclusion that you have to come to, even at this early stage, is that if they were honest about it, and of course they would be, they were looking at something other than the inbound American Airlines jet. And so it was a matter of identity. Thirdly, we've got a situation in which the ability for both pilots to see each other was extremely difficult, not just because of nightfall, but because of the direction of the jet was traveling from left to right in the perspective of the helicopter and in the perspective of the jet. Probably with the captain flying, he'd be in the left seat and almost unable to see anything out of the right approaching him the way the helicopter did. We know they came together. We know that we don't have the final details on what broke off and went into the water from the jet and from the helicopter, but we have all the wreckage coming to the surface, and so that will eventually be solved down to a very finite degree.
In terms of how rare this is, how common or uncommon are these sort of air collisions?
Very, very, very uncommon to have a in-flight collision. We've seen a number of them over the years in smaller airplanes, smaller uncontrolled airports. But as far as large jets or passenger-carrying aircraft are concerned, the last major occurrence in my memory was Cerritos, California, many decades ago, when a small private plane intersected a DC-9 and with loss of everybody aboard both aircraft. One of the reasons that it's so rare is because our air traffic control at time, and we basically have a much greater capability to keep people apart. And we have a thing called TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System, on all the passenger carrying craft. Now, TCAS was not aboard, as best we know, the helicopter, the Black Hawk, in this instance, and it probably wouldn't have been of any use because it automatically nulls out any descent rate, any calling for a descent, under about 1,100 feet. Normally, what happens is two black boxes, one in each aircraft, talk to each other at very high speed. One of them has an agreement with the other. You tell your pilot to descend, I'll tell my pilot to ascend. But if you're under 1,100 feet, you can see how that could create an accident. So what part that they null out, in the words of aviation, is the part that would order a descent. Now, if that had actually been aboard the Black Hawk and the ascent part was still there, it could have told one of the pilots to climb, and that might have avoided the collision. But that's a lot of speculation.
In terms of, you mentioned the issue of visibility and it being at night. A caller called in, because we were on the air a couple hours after this happened. A caller, I believe it was Liz in Florida, called in and she said, well, maybe this is more likely to happen at night because people can't see as well. And now, this is what she said to me, now I'm much more reluctant to take flights at night. Is there anything to that, John? Is visibility significantly worse at night? Should people have any hesitation about flying at night?
Interestingly enough, if it had been daylight, we would have had a higher propensity of having this happen because it's even more difficult to pick out a fairly small moving aircraft target like a helicopter against the background of everything that you can see in daytime. At nighttime, you're looking for lights. And lights are easy to spot, relatively speaking. What we obviously had here, and I do say obviously, and usually I'm much more reluctant to use that word at this stage of an investigation, but obviously we have the helicopter crew believing that they were spotting and tracking the commercial jet, the American Airlines jet, when they weren't looking at the same thing. That's something that you would expect to have happen in the daytime in a very bad situation, but not at night when you can see the lights. In this particular case, they probably mistook the lights of another aircraft for the one that they were supposed to follow, or rather pass behind.
At 30 minutes after the hour, this is The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is John Nance, aviation analyst for ABC News, best-selling author, pilot, licensed attorney, you name it. John, the first thing that a lot of people started raising beyond their theories as to what happened here is the question of what's a Black Hawk helicopter doing flying in this same area? Is that common? Should a Black Hawk helicopter be flying in the same skies as other airplanes like this?
Well, we've got a matrix of different military operators providing executive transport, high-ranking officer transport, and also what is referred to as basically survival of government resources. In other words, they've got a mission to do. It's not just random back and forth. And that mission is very important. There's no question about it. But the methodology that has been used for a very long time to keep these helicopters, which of course can hover and can fly very low, to keep them out of the pathway of other traffic, not just airliners, has been to come up with these corridors and say you can fly in these. You've got to have contact with the radio authority. Basically, in this situation, it would have been the tower at DCA, that's Reagan National. And there are a couple of other things that you've got to do in terms of getting into and getting out of those corridors. You can't go over 200 feet, and that supposedly then solves the problem and deconflicts the traffic. But First of all, you're subject to a single point mistake, and we try to avoid single point mistakes, especially potential fatal ones in aviation. That single point mistake may have been demonstrated in this case by them flying at 325 feet, plus or minus about 25. And we don't know that for certain yet because the flight data from the recorder on the Black Hawk has not been rendered. It will give us a definitive word on exactly what altitude above the ground, above the water, that aircraft, that helicopter was traveling. If, in fact, it was 325 feet, then the assumption is that you have had this helicopter get itself into a position of being in airspace that is not cleared. And it's easy to look at that and say, well, this is the cause of the accident. Well, it is one of the major components of the accident, but we never look at one thing because there's never just one cause. We look at a multiplicity of causes and say each one of those has to be considered in terms of what needs to be fixed and changed in order to make this not happen again. So, yes, being at the same altitude, apparently, not for certain, but apparently is a major aspect of this. But the other part is that the structure of that system is just too dangerous. And here's why. It's fine if you've got the helicopters all flying faithfully at or below 200 feet for those corridors, but if you've got airplanes that are maneuvering for landing on runway 1 or runway 33 at Reagan National, and when a pilot is maneuvering for a landing like that, especially in visual conditions, day or night, he or she will be focused on the runway, and they may be a little above, they may be a little below, because that's perfectly legal and proper for them to make an approach where maybe they're dipping under a little bit, and now they're at or below 200 feet. And if you're saying that a 200-foot limitation has to be there for everybody, now you have distracted those pilots because they can't descend below 200 feet until some point in time over the Potomac. That's not the way this is supposed to work, and it inserts a gambling element into it, which must not be there.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Here at the Almond Joy Factory, where tropical vibes abound, we use soft, fresh-tasting coconut.
The crunchiest almonds and delicious chocolate candy.
Ah, but do you know what our most important ingredient is? Sometimes you feel like a nut.
Sometimes you don't.
Almond Joy's got nuts and something even way better than that. Yes, Almond Joy is made with almonds and joy.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
A couple of things just on what you said with respect to the height that the helicopter was flying at. One of the things that the president mentioned is that the helicopter was flying too high. And that's something that I've heard other people mention as well, that this helicopter was flying too high. By the way, if you're just tuning in, this is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. My guest is John Nance. Just to clarify, was this Black Hawk helicopter, in fact, flying at a height that it should not have been flying at?
We don't know that yet. We do know this. We know that the controller's scope was showing 200 feet, which is exactly what it should have shown. But we also know that what drives that figure and puts it on the scope of the controller in the tower, is a system that is less reliable than some of the others that we have, like one which is ADS-B, which would give you a very positive readout of altitude. So we've got conflicting information. The controllers were apparently told 200 feet by the automation, and yet we have another indication from an ADS-B that the airplane was at 325 feet, and that was the same altitude that they found the jet, the American Airlines. So we do not know yet whether that's a true statement or not, but it certainly appears that they found each other regardless of what altitude they were at, and this is my point. The American Airlines flight was doing exactly what they should have been doing, and they were not limited to above or below 200 or 300 feet because they're on approach for landing.
The commands that you alluded to, where it sounds like the helicopter might have been referring to another airplane that it said it has eyes on. As best we can tell, even with that miscommunication, do we think that the correct commands were given from the air traffic control tower? And it also seems like, miscommunication aside, it was not as if any of these commands were being ignored.
No, they were not being ignored. To the best of my knowledge, I didn't hear anything that had no answer to it. And on top of that, well, let me just say that there is not a scintilla of evidence yet, nothing, and I don't expect there to be, that says that or alludes to the air traffic controllers having done anything wrong, anything incorrect, or anything marginal. And for any high official, especially the highest one, to stand up there and make a statement like that is absurd and outrageous and unforgivable. Certainly early in an investigation. That just really angers the heck out of me.
Well, so the comment that he made that ignited a firestorm, and honestly, a caller mentioned this a couple hours after it happened, and without us having any information, and I scoffed at it because I thought it was so absurd. Little did I know that the president was going to say the same thing the following day, was that this could be potentially related to DEI practices in the FAA or some other regulatory authority or some other government agency. From what you can tell, there's no evidence that played a role at all.
None whatsoever. And I monitored the ATC constantly as part of my job for ABC. And I have never seen such a thing. And the reason why this is so ridiculous is because the FAA does not put anything in front of the candidate for a position except the required stuff that needs to be done, and that is without variation. In other words, not everybody can do that job. We're expecting 100% performance out of people 100% of the time. And if you human beings can't really come up to that standard most of the time, but air traffic controllers, for some reason, do. I've seen absolutely nothing to indicate that their hiring, their training, anything has been modified for any reason, not just the DEI stuff.
The other rumor or theory, I guess, that a lot of people have asked me about is whether it's possible that the Black Hawk helicopter pilot was on some sort of a suicide mission. It sounds like, based on what you're saying so far, you think that's probably unlikely.
I would be, let's put it this way. I've written 17 fiction books, usually against a backdrop of aviation, and that's not a scenario I would ever write about or come up with because it just doesn't make sense. Now, here's where we have to step back a second and say the difference in analyzing these things is the difference between possibility and probability. Was it possible that a UFO came out of somewhere and hit them with a beam? Yes, it's possible, but not probable. Is it possible that this was something that the pilots or one of the pilots did voluntarily? Possible, yes, but hideously improbable. So when you deal with stuff like that, it's like I said the other day about the accident in Philadelphia. There is one aspect that you have to mention, just so everybody knows that it's under consideration, and that is a affirmative act. In other words, somebody who pushed the yoke over and forced the airplane into the ground. There is not a scintilla of evidence that happened, but you have to consider it as a possibility. When you, as the NTSB, lay everything out on the table and say, we don't rule anything in, we don't rule anything out, we just follow the evidence.
Since you mentioned the Philadelphia situation, very sad situation, and, as terrible as it was, certainly seems like it could have been much worse with a lot of people on the ground injured or hurt as well. It seems like that's largely avoided. What happened there? Why did that Philadelphia incident take place?
Well, there again, this is preliminary, and there are very, very little markers along the road here to figuring this out at this point. Now, I'm hoping, and it's probably against hope because they're not normally carried and they're not required, that there is some sort of a voice recorder and a possible flight data recorder that was aboard the airplane. That would help tremendously. But what we had was an airplane that could only stay airborne for 40 seconds for whatever reason. It took off with a moderately full, probably not full, but close to it, load of avgas, or not avgas, but kerosene, which is jet fuel. And the weather was not really a major factor because you can climb into an IFR situation, that stands for Instrument Flight Rules, and the ceiling was 700 feet, which was certainly enough for takeoff or legal and a smart takeoff. In other words, you wouldn't be concerned about that. And this is a very sophisticated jet, even though it was a bit older. So all of those things point to the fact that this should have been a successful takeoff, and yet it comes screaming out of the sky at 280 knots on a direct line and would impact that intersection. And the reason why has to be along these lines. One, something catastrophic happened in that airplane. Was it the flight control system, which is pretty difficult to believe. This is boilerplate stuff, but it's possible. Was it something to do with, for instance, an oxygen bottle exploding in the cabin? That's a little far out. I don't know what would cause that, but there were oxygen bottles, medical oxygen bottles, in the cabin, and of course they weren't very high. They were 1,700 feet at the top of climb. Something catastrophic happened. That's obviously clear. But in order to find out what it is, the NTSB is going to have to go through a horrendous amount of scrap material and try everything they can to put the matrix together of the facts of what we know happened with the flight path, and then try to back into it with any shred of evidence that they can find. This one is going to be a very difficult one.
I guess it should go without saying, but I'll ask you to reiterate anyway. No connection whatsoever between what happened in D.C. and what happened in Philadelphia, right?
I can't see any possible connection in any way, form, or fashion, no.
Okay, let me ask you about what happened on Sunday. The FAA said that its primary system for sending real-time safety alerts to pilots was operational again after being down for several hours. What was this system that was down, and how much of a cause for concern was that or is that?
Well, we've been here before because this is the NOTAM system, which stands for Notice to Airmen. And it has gone through a number of evolutions in the last 20 years or so on. But they've got a backup now, and the backup worked, which is something to say because 10 years ago, there really was no backup. And when the NOTAM system went down, there was no way for pilots or operational departments, such as what we call our dispatchers in commercial aviation, to check and see what notices have been put out there. For instance, you're going to a particular airport, you want to know, are all the approaches available? Are there any radio facilities there that are out? Are there any taxiways that are blocked? That's what comes over the NOTAM system. So the fact that they had a backup is a real feather in the cap of the FAA, but the fact that the primary system failed indicates that we've still got work to do, and a lot of it.
The issue of staffing and personnel, I know that you said it seems like the air traffic control tower did everything it was supposed to be doing. It was reported that one person was doing the job of two.
Yes.
How much of a problem is that, the staffing shortages at this agency?
Two answers, right? Number one, it is a perennial problem to be understaffed throughout the air traffic control system. And every year, Congress is begged to provide more money, and every year they come up short, and this has been going on for decades. It really needs to stop. These people are extremely important. Their welfare is important. Their lack of fatigue, hopefully, is important. And so this is a perennial problem that goes back literally decades. We've got to get this fixed. eventually, I hope. Now, and specifically with respect to this tower and this accident, it is a standard procedure for one of the supervisors to make the decision to let somebody go home and to just have one person of the 4 or 5 that are still there working 2 positions, essentially, working the visual back and forth with helicopters and the possibly departure or arrival on the field. It is a judgment call. It's an analog judgment call. And whether or not this was a correct call will have to be determined. And secondly, whether or not there was more information that the controller, the supervisor, needed to be able to make the call will also be on the table. These helicopter flights go on all the time, so that part is routine, and you can see that unless there is a sudden buildup of air traffic, which for DCA would be kind of surprising because you've got a long list of things that have to be done before you can file your flight plan into DCA. Unless something had popped up at the last minute, was disregarded, I think we're going to find that this was a routine procedure that needs to be revisited on a broader scale.
Final question, John, and I appreciate you being so generous with your time so late at night. It was reported that there was a near miss the day before the DC collision. How common are these near misses?
Well, that kind of near miss is interesting because just about every time you've got a helicopter in that corridor at or below 200 feet passing under traffic that is headed for runway 1 or 33, you've got what could be considered a near miss. In other words, they are less than a mile apart and sometimes just, like 200 or 300 feet apart. Now, if everything works as it was supposed to, the helicopter no higher than 200 feet, et cetera, and everything else kind of proper, then you're not going to have a near miss in terms of a reportable incident. But in my view, that's what we've been doing here is depending on this very close proximity to not go wrong because of everybody doing their job exactly right. And I think that has to be changed. It just has to be changed.
John Nance, it's always a treat to talk with you. I'm sorry that so often it seems to be in the aftermath of these disasters. I hope we can chat again soon.
Anytime, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you, John Nance. If you want to comment on any portion of our conversation, you can feel free to give me a call, 646-720-0635. That's 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.